Since we launched the REDD+ mechanism, this was 2005. This was a paper that I wrote that was about 3 pages long that said, we have a problem. Developing country forests are a big source of emissions, but we as poor countries need financial incentives if we're going to slow, stop, and reverse deforestation. We can become part of the solution if we have the finance to help us to move to sustainable livelihoods. The good news is, and I'm going to talk about this later, developing countries have been performing. 13 gigatons of emission reductions under Article 5 from developing countries. Our partners, these are governments that we negotiate with on the floor, have only provided finance for 3% of those emission reductions. But the private sector, now with Article 6, is very interested. They need to be educated. But at the same time, we as developing countries need to be educated. Negotiating with a foreign government is time-consuming, has a lot of requirements, a lot of agreements, but also with the private sector. If we're going to be bringing in the private sector, it's going to take some time. We're going to have to set up the proper institutions. We have to structure things properly. And the goal is that we as countries are available to work with either parties or the private sector. Most people don't understand the speed and scale with which we have to reduce emissions. 1.5 degrees means 2.5 gigatons of emission reductions every year starting last year. And last year, emissions went up. Not down 2.5 gigatons, went up. This isn't about avoidance. This is not about getting credit for a theoretical emission in the future. The science demands us to look at emission sources today and figure out how to close them down, how to transition away from them. This is about reductions. Reductions against real existing historical emissions and increase of removals. And that's where we as developing countries have been leading the way. We have been achieving real emission reductions, verified twice under the Paris Agreement, with the speed and scale that 1.5 degrees requires, but we've been doing it largely alone. It's been a long journey. You all know this. 2004, we started the coalition. 2005, we put in the first submission. We've been working hard. A lot of people talk about the Warsaw Framework. REDD+ under the Paris Agreement is so much more than that. We have about 26 decisions, not just the 16 or whatever in the Warsaw Framework. And we as developing countries are implementing all of those. It's about 54 different things that each country has to do in order to qualify. Here's the good news. Around 95% of the world's rainforests are now part of the UNFCCC REDD+ mechanism. First time in human history that we have had the vast majority of rainforests under an incentive framework where developing countries should be compensated for reducing their emissions and enhancing removals. All the rules are agreed. 65 tropical countries are engaged, and it's working. Gigatons and gigatons of verified emission reductions. About 85% of the countries that have submitted their reference levels under the Paris Agreement have failed. That's an 85% failure rate. The most rigorous standard in the world. No other standard has had an 85% failure rate. And when I say failure, that means that you have to go back and revise your reference level. Your reference level doesn't pass, and you have to resubmit. When it comes to submitting results, over 50% of our results, we failed on the first try. We've had to go back, we've had to correct our numbers, we've had to improve our transparency. And this review process takes 2 to 3 years. This is the most robust independent review process in the world. We have many in the private sector that are sincere about net zero plans. How do we bring this together? And how do we listen to each other so that we can meet each other's requirements.